So yesterday saw the launch of the new Alder Lake processors from Intel, and it gives us an exciting time to be tech enthusiasts again, with Intel finally bringing the fight back to AMD. And while we looked at 3 models of CPU in that dedicated video, I wanted to make another video for each individual CPU, going into kind of a bit more detail, explaining our testing and how we tested each individual processor. Starting with this one, the i9-12900K. Let's do this.
Are you a champion in the making?
Yeah, I mean, my mum always calls me a little champ, so...
Then you need the new Corsair Champion Series K70 10 keyless keyboard to heighten your gameplay and really kick the competition's arse.
So I'll be an even better gamer if I get one?
Yes, thanks to the 8000Hz hyperpolling, a durable aluminium frame and a tournament mode switch that disables the macros and lighting for those intense gaming sessions. You'll be tearing up the battlefield in no time.
Wow, I can't wait to show everyone my sick moves. Yeah!
No, stop that now, and click the link in the description below. Seriously, stop dancing.
So first things first, new studio. Like it? No? Let us know. It will evolve into probably something much more. So back on track, and for anyone who hasn't seen any form of content revolving around Alder Lake, and more importantly the 12900K, let me give you the lowdown. And yes, I'm still young enough to say lowdown, even if I do have grey hair. So the i9-12900K is Intel's flagship processor for their 12th generation Alder Lake line of processors. Now, it's using the LGA 1700 socket, and you will notice the chip itself is actually kind of larger than what we've seen for quite a fair few generations, being more rectangular than square. Looking at history, the 10th and more importantly the 11th gen flagships were a real disappointment overall, especially to the strides that AMD were making with huge IPC improvements generation over generation, with improved memory support, faster cores and more importantly, frankly, more of them. Intel, well, they were sticking with their 14nm plus technology, and this just kind of saw them end up with what most would describe as a hot mess. Then they announced that with Alder Lake, we'd see a change in fabrication process, broadly known as Intel 7. Not to be confused with it being 7nm, but in a kind of weird way of describing that not all fabrication processes are equal, and actually being 10nm, but equivalent of AMD's 7nm process donned by TSMC. Now, hopefully you can get your head around that, and it's not too difficult to understand, because trust me, it's bloody difficult to explain, and I'm not even sure if Intel really quite understand it. What we found with this new process is that after consumers screamed at Intel to make the bold leap, it's actually paid off in dividends, as it's improved on the areas that frankly they were lacking, including gaming performance. Now, you may remember AMD stole the crown of Gaming King with the Ryzen 5000 series, where they had set goals of improving performance specifically in gaming. Well, Intel decided that they wanted to take that back after letting AMD essentially borrow it for a little while. So the 12900K, how much is it and why are the specs kind of so confusing to some people? Well, I'm hoping this video can address some concerns, especially with the market we're in right now and the fact that an MSRP literally means diddly squat. I mean, just look at Nvidia and AMD GPUs right now. So you'll actually be pleased to know that looking around at UK and US retailers, it's actually priced where it should be, with the 12900K being sold at the time of filming for £580 in the UK at the likes of Scan and eBuyer, and $649 in the US at places like Micro Center. Now, over the last 24 hours, I saw people complaining about a $1,250 price tag, and I can only assume you're really, honestly, looking in the wrong places. So, it's a lot of money, I guess. But it does, at least in a pricing sense, sit comfortably between the 5900X and the 5950X processors from AMD. I mean, will this mean that AMD could potentially do some price cuts, especially as we near closer to Black Friday? I mean, honestly, I wouldn't completely say that it's out of the question. We've definitely seen a fair share of price cutting over the years to fend off competition. So for that money, you get the new Alder Lake hybrid architecture. Sounds cool, right? Now this basically means it consists of big little cores, meaning that you end up with 16 cores, 8 being performance cores and 8 being efficiency cores, but you end up with 24 threads, as the 8 performance cores include hyperthreading for those kind of bigger workload tasks, while the efficiency cores are more geared towards background tasks and offloading those workloads. Now, The performance cores have the typical kind of various turbo technologies, including single max turbo of 5.2 GHz, boost max 3 frequency of the same 5.2 GHz, and a max turbo on all cores of 5.1 GHz. This is talking about the performance cores. We'll also be looking to see how far we can overclock things in the future, but we want to do it under a custom loop, probably in the coming week or so. So again, make sure you're subscribed for that, as it actually should be quite interesting to see what we can gain when, I guess, essentially thermal headroom is increased. Speaking of thermal headroom, this was a major concern as the PBP, or processor base power, comes in at 125 watts. So essentially 20 watts higher than AMD's 5950X. But it's worth noting it has a maximum turbo power of 241 watts, hence why we saw 101 degrees in our Cinebench R23 load tests. Now, talking of our tests and benchmarks, people weren't happy that we didn't test the 5800X in comparison. And maybe we'll do that in some kind of a showdown at a later date, featuring that. Though, I did kind of feel it was redundant, as both the 5900X and the 5950X were both spanked by Intel when it comes to gaming, which is kind of what Intel actually set out to do. So the 5800X, in theory, would be spanked more. But you made it clear in the comments that's what you want to see. Don't worry though, as when it comes to gaming, we will be retesting all of the processors in a whole host of games, and actually including the 5800X in there too. So make sure you're subscribed for that one. Now, if you've not seen our main video, let me talk through the test bench firstly, as some people actually commented on that. We did actually mention it in our Motherboard Roundup, so again, it's in there. You can find all that info over on our website, eTeknix.com, but for the sake of this video, this is what we used. We used the Asus Maximus Z690 Hero motherboard with the latest 0702 BIOS. We used 32 gig of Corsair Dominator RGB 5200 MHz DDR5, comprising of two 16 gig sticks, and to keep things as cool as physically possible, we went with the Noctua D15S Chromax Black, and due to the LGA 1700 socket, we had to use the mounting kit to make it fit, which for anyone who doesn't know is available from Noctua free of charge with proof of purchase of the original cooler. For our GPU, we went with the RTX 3080 Gaming OC from Gigabyte, and to make sure we had no bottleneck from our storage, we went with the latest Seagate Firecooler 530 PCI Express 4 NVMe 2TB drive. For power, we went with the Corsair HX 750 750 watt platinum rated power supply, and we tested everything on Windows 10. And I'll explain why we did that a little bit later on. So first up, we saw 3D Mark V Strike, giving us a small lead over the 5950X and, well, frankly, quite a big leap over the 5900X, especially when we look at the physics score, showing that not all applications crave huge amounts of fast cores and instead are potentially more geared towards more efficient architecture that can spread the load of the task across its various cores. TimeSpy saw the lead from Intel grow even larger by just over 1600 points as an overall score. The healthy CPU score of 19,000 over AMD scores of just under 12,000 really helped to boost this overall score and show again that more cores doesn't necessarily mean more performance, at least in this test. PCMark actually saw the 5950X come out above the 12900K, but I don't think Intel will be too bothered by it when looking at the 51 point difference, especially given that the price difference is over £100 in the UK and around $50 in the US. Now, when comparing to the 5900X, which is the cheaper of the two chips, the 12900K comes out on top by 235 points. To put it into some more perspective, the 11900K, which was launched less than a year ago, actually saw a similar result to the 5900X, so PCMark clearly favours Intel and its newest flagship chip. Moving on to Geekbench, and you're probably starting to see a little bit of a trend as we go through. Looking at single core performance, the 12900K has a whopping lead of 17.9% over the 5950X and a 21% lead over the 5900X. Again, the 11900K, which was widely regarded as, well, a pretty terrible chip overall, ended up beating both AMD CPUs here too, just showing that the 12th gen further improves on its single core performance, which as we know is still a very important part of any processor in today's applications. Single core is one area that the 12900K excelled, but multi-core Geekbench simply dominated, with a 36% lead over the 5950X and 46.9% lead over the 5900X. When comparing to the 11900K, the new flagship gives us a whopping 73% improvement, showing that Intel have really put a lot of time into bringing improvements to these kind of workload applications over its last generation, while also handing a kind of bit of a slap to AMD in the process. W Prime saw the 32M workload finish just a smidge quicker than the 5950X, again further showing us that Intel were able to compete with fewer big cores and threads overall. At 1024M, the 5950X was able to claw things back slightly, albeit only by around 5 seconds. The 12900K actually sits comfortably between both Ryzen processors, which is kind of what you'd expect based on its price positioning. SuperPi 32M saw the 12900K out on top again by just short of 30 seconds over the 5950X, and an 8-second lead on top of that against the 5900X. Funnily enough, the 11900K gave us a similar result with a difference of 3 seconds, and though it's not featured in this chart, the 12700K actually gave us a result of 5 minutes and 56 seconds, also beating out both AMD Ryzen processors, and that sits at a much lower price point overall. Moving on to some web browser based tests in Google Octane. Although the benchmark is retired and no new versions are coming, it's still a great workload test to run for comparisons, especially considering how much browser usage the average consumer has on their system. The results speak for themselves, with a 20% lead over the 5950X and 24% lead over the 5900X. Obviously, make sure you have a decent amount of memory if you are using any form of browser, especially Chrome, but paired with the 12900K and you're onto a winner on these types of workload tests. Mozilla Kraken saw a similar story, showing that the 12900K did it quite a bit faster than both the 5950X and 5900X. Again, for the sake of comparison, the 11900K was very similar in time to the 5900X, showing that Intel also had an upper hand with these types of tests, and just kind of improved on that by quite some margin when it comes to Alder Lake. We will also be releasing standalone videos for the 12700K and 12600K, and just as a bit of a spoiler, they also beat the offerings from AMD. WebExpert is a much longer test comprising of photo enhancement tests, graph creation, and other HTML5 and JavaScript based tasks. Overall, both the 5900X and 5950X beat the 12900K here, and funnily enough, the 11900K also beat the 12900K by 3 points. Maybe this type of test does actually favour a higher core count, and that's why we saw these types of results, though the scores overall were still very close. Looking at 7-zip and how it's split into compression and decompression tests, we saw a massive difference between the 12900K and both parts from AMD. It was odd to see the 5900X beating its bigger brother, and we did go back to double check these results and confirm that they were accurate. This gave us a 46% margin between the 5950X and the 12900K, and also saw a whopping 79% increase between the 11900K and Intel's new flagship. With decompression, the story was a little bit different, still showing a nice improvement gen on gen, but AMD really shining on both the 5950X and 5900X. So this goes to show that in some areas there is still work to be done from Team Blue. Moving on to the Corona benchmark, and we did see that AMD finished the render slightly quicker on the 5950X, though only by around 8 seconds, while the 5900X actually was slower by around 4 seconds, again comfortably putting the 12900K between the two Ryzen 9 chips from AMD, which at least from a price perspective is where you'd expect it to be. Sticking with rendering and the Blender benchmark running the BMW test, we saw a slightly different story, with the 12900K beating the 5950X by 8 seconds and the 5900X by 27 seconds. For a small and short test, this is pretty impressive when looking at render studios, where this could be potentially 100 times bigger, meaning that using the same formula, something that much bigger could take on average an extra 45 minutes to render. And with anything with this kind of workload, time is money. Moving on to a synthetic benchmark, but on the gaming side of things, I wasn't that impressed overall. Intel claimed to be the gaming king when it came to the 12900K, but we saw quite the opposite here, and with only 0.5% increase gen on gen and actually falling behind both AMD chips, which funnily enough scored the same, albeit by 1 point, which could be argued as margin of error. Cinebench R15 I do want to touch on, but not in too much detail. I wanted to include it as we saw from our tests that something was clearly wrong with the way that the 12th gen processors run on it, and this was the case for all of our chips. And even after some troubleshooting involving retesting, reinstalling Windows and so forth, for transparency and to show that we're not a shill for anyone, we thought it was wise to show this here, and hopefully if a fix comes we can revisit it, but with newer versions of Cinebench being out, I doubt we'll actually see that. Speaking of newer versions, Cinebench R20 being split into both single and multi-core tests, we saw great results in both tests with the 12900K steaming ahead, and even the 11900K having that better single core performance than both Ryzen 9s. Multi-core was a similar story for the 12900K, beating out both the 5950X and 5900X, and also showing that the 11900K wasn't really that great with these types of multi-core workloads, and showing the huge improvement gains that the new Alder Lake chip has now got. Cinebench R23 had a very similar story again. Single core performance saw a comfortable lead on the 12900K of around 23.8% over the 5950X and 24.6% over the 5900X. More impressive again is that the 11900K beat both chips too, but still saw a nice jump gen over gen. Again, in multi-core performance, the 11900K really did show its age and, more importantly, technology, and saw a huge 78.9% leap when comparing 11th to 12th generation. The lead was much narrower between the 5950X and 12900K of around 10%, which, if I was Intel, I'd be more than happy with, especially considering the difference when looking at the number of cores and threads. The lead gets even bigger when we bring the 5900X into the mix of around 28% between both AMD and Intel. Handbrake showed that when it comes to video conversion, AMD still hold the title here on both the 5900X and 5950X, but the strangest thing was that the 11900K was following closely behind and instead saw the 12900K quite a fair bit lower. Talking internally, we can potentially assume that the software itself hasn't been fully optimized for Alder Lake's architecture, and as a company who works a lot with video production, I'll be keeping a close eye on this to see if there's any gains that can be made in the future. Vray is another test that focuses on rendering, and based on the results, I think it's safe to say that in this type of workload, the extra cores and threads do make a difference, with the 5950X coming out on top, the 12900K sitting below it, and then the 5900X having a wider margin beneath that. Ada64 was one of the tests I was really looking forward to, as so far it's a tough one to judge how much of a difference DDR5 has made over DDR4, and how much is solely down to the architecture itself. We do have our Motherboard Roundup video going through both DDR4 and DDR5 socket 1700 setups, which should give you a little bit of a clearer picture, but as expected we do have a much higher bandwidth throughput with the newer, faster DDR5 kit on the 12900K, when compared both to AMD and the 11900K setup. Latency does fall behind a little bit, but if the past has taught us anything, DDR5 will mature, it will get faster, timings will tighten, and in about 6 months' time this will be a completely different story. Moving on to the part that I was most excited about due to Intel's brash message of being the best gaming processor on the market, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. The 11900K gave us an average of 179 FPS at 1080p on high settings, with the 5950X coming in at 195, and the 5900X just behind at 193 FPS. Ryzen's 5000 improvements really propelled them kind of over Intel's 11th gen when it came to gaming, and this was something that Intel were keen to claw back, and they most certainly did, at 213 frames per second on the 12900K, with a comfortable 9.2% lead over the flagship from AMD, 5950X, and 10.3% over the 5900X. Far Cry 6 saw a much closer story, with the average being matched on both the 12900K and the 5900X, which, as we know, is the better chip when gaming across a much bigger sample of games. What we did find, however, is that the minimum FPS was much higher on the 12900K at 113 compared to the 99 FPS on the 5950X and 102 on the 5900X. Being a Ubisoft game, I can only assume that there may be some kind of bug restricting us to 117 FPS, and it's definitely something we'll look into for a follow-up gaming video on these chips. Metro, while the minimum FPS was similar across all chips tested, the average saw the 11900K and AMD chips very similar, at around 2 FPS difference, which could be argued as margin of error. The 12900K pushed ahead by around 6 to 7 FPS, again doing what they set out to do, even in a game as intensive as this. World of Tanks, while it doesn't show us FPS, it does give us a score, which with and without ray tracing saw the 12900K at the top of the stack compared to all other processors tested from both AMD and Intel. In terms of power consumption, we saw some pretty impressive numbers at idle, with our total system draw on the Intel flagship at 61.2 watts, around 20 watts lower than both AMD parts. It also shows that those efficiency cores are doing their job, as we see a modest 17.1 watts difference compared to the 11900K. When it came to load under Cinebench R23 on a multi-core test, we saw that maximum turbo power jump straight in, and see our total system draw at 359 watts. Quite a big jump up from AMD's 5950X, 5900X, and even the 11900K. Does this extra power translate to heat though? Well, under our Noctua D15S air cooler, we saw a comfortable idle temperature of 26 degrees, with an ambient room temperature of 21 degrees plus or minus 1 to 2 degrees. We tried to keep our conditions as fair as possible to give the most accurate results. The AMD processors, which are known to incorporate quite a liberal voltage range, sat around 8 to 10 degrees hotter in the same conditions. When it came to gaming load, both AMD processors were able to come in comfortably around 70 degrees, with the 11900K slightly warmer by 2 degrees. The 12900K and the fact that, based on findings, having more of a kind of hot spot, came in at 82 degrees during the same Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark run. Under load of Cinebench R23 multi-core, this is where we saw issue with the 12900K, actually on its way past 100 degrees at 101. We did then start to see a little bit of thermal throttling, and at a point before the fan on our Noctua cooler could even ramp up properly, the test had finished. AMD clearly have things a little more under control during this type of workload, and it goes to show that while Intel have had some great results throughout all these tests, there are, I guess, still some areas that need working on. And this kind of brings me on to overclocking as well. This is one of the reasons why we didn't do it. We will be doing it on custom loop, but at 101 degrees, I mean, where are you expecting the headroom to come from? So if you haven't seen my roundup video, let me go through kind of what I think. Intel set out to do a few clear things. Take back the market that they lost to Team Red, and more importantly, become the gaming king. I mean, did they do that? Most definitely. The majority of our tests saw Intel not only bringing the fight to AMD, but decimating them too. But I am anxious, because could this be kind of a leapfrog effect where the newer product is better than the competitor's older product? Well, to find out, we'll have to wait and see what AMD do to retaliate. Do they bring out an XT variant like we saw on the Ryzen 3000 series? Or do they simply cut the prices of their current stack? Or will we see something new from them a lot sooner than we first thought? I guess with that, only time will tell. Now, other things that we have to consider is, what does the future actually hold for Intel? Right now, the 12900K brings a host of new goodies, some of which are ready but not quite there, like DDR5, and some which just aren't there at all, like PCI Express 5.0. Right now, Intel with their 12th generation processors, coupled with a Z690 chipset, kind of being led by the 12900K, well, Intel essentially hold all the chips, excuse the pun. If you want the latest tech, you have to go with Intel. If you want a competitive alternative, then AMD is there, and still go down fighting and actually show Intel a thing or two when it comes to power consumption and temperatures, the main areas where this kind of failed. Now you will notice, as I mentioned, we didn't do any overclocking, and from what we've seen from the pros under LN2 and the like, there is actually pretty good headroom, and it's something that I do want to visit, but under a custom loop. I mean, like I mentioned, it already runs pretty hot, and I do feel that the thermal throttling will just undo any headroom that you may want to unlock through overclocking. So make sure you're subscribed if you want to see that. I mean, EK actually sent us their newest LGA 1700 Velocity 2 block, so it'll be good to kind of see how that fares with the 12900K. Now I did mention that we tested everything on Windows 10, and the reason that we didn't use Windows 11 was at the time of starting our testing, there was obviously still the situation with the L3 cache issue on AMD and essentially performance being nerfed, but it is something that we are actually looking at revisiting, where we can do a Windows 10 versus Windows 11 showdown on a variety of different processors. We'll also be looking at the gaming side of things in more detail in an upcoming showdown, so people have, as I mentioned, asked to see the 5800X performance in comparison. So we'll chuck that in for good measure. Apparently we didn't show it because we're Intel shills. Let me kind of level with you. People told us this is what Intel dictated, that's why we didn't have it. So if that's the case, I'm going to be changing the colour of my car to blue, or at least getting an Intel logo slapped on the side of it to, pay my dues to them. For anyone who really knows me and has met me or spoke to me on social media or even on our Discord channel, shameless plug, but the link is below in the description, you'll know that I can't be bought and I adhere to journalistic integrity and have done since I created eTeknix. We can't be bought and we never will be. If we're paid for any content, it will be classed as sponsored content and will be made very, very clear in the description, on the video, everywhere. So anything else you want to see, let me know in the comments section. I really want to sort of, try and get as much out of this and show you guys as much as we can with the 12900K. Like I said, we will have more content like this for other SKUs as well, looking at iGPU performance, especially given that GPUs are still, pretty hard to come by. Now, one key thing I do want to mention, and that comes down to DDR5 and, well, certain retailers. Like I know, Scan in the UK, they're only selling it as part of a bundle with a board and a processor. So if you're wondering why you can't get any, that's why. This may differ from each retailer and obviously each country, but kind of makes sense to eliminate scalpers. They're not going to buy a bundle just to try and raise the price on one part. Now, if you are on the fence about what to buy, definitely, as I mentioned, head over to our Discord. We'll be more than happy to give you some advice. And if you want to support us, you can do so through Patreon or by clicking the little join button below this video. Other than that, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, you know exactly what to do, and I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys.